introduce Professor Carlotta Ferrara degli Uberti, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right, from the University of Pisa. She is going to talk about, the title of her talk is Italian Jews and Nation Building, Culture, Identity, Politics, Social Changes. And we are delighted to have her here. The talk is sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Ferrara degli Uberti has previously been an associate professor of Italian history at University College London. She's now at the University of Pisa in Pisa, Italy, where she teaches modern European history, modern Jewish history, and history of anti-Semitism. She is co-founder and editor of the series Routledge Studies in the Modern History of Italy, and has published extensively on 19th and early 20th century Italian Jewish history. The history of marriage and divorce features prominently among her research interests, with a focus on the relation between civil and religious law. So Professor degli Uberti, as you were just saying, she's in the middle of a move, so we're so delighted to have her take the time to speak with us. Thank you so much. So I'll begin with a question, and if you'd like to share your PowerPoint slides at any time, I think it's enabled for you. So I'm not sure how much of our audience will be well versed in the role of Jewish community members in the unification period of 19th century Italy. Some may be very well versed in it and others not. So if I understand correctly, before unification, Italy was made up of Italian states, but it was not formally unified as a nation state. So does the unification reflect Italy moving to a nation state framework per se? And was it in some way, in some way a response to the revolutions of 1848?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, for having me, and I'm really delighted to be part of this event. So I am a historian, as has already been said, and my work focuses on Italian Jewish history mainly between the end of the 18th century and the early 20th century, so before fascism. But in the past 20 years, I have been particularly interested in the post-unification period, so post-1861, post-unification and post-emancipation period. In Italy, those two coincide, as we will see. And so today, thanks also to the to Patricia's questions and prompts. So my intention is to present some of the key features of these decades of Italian and Italian Jewish history. And your first question allows me to begin with a little bit of a context before we dive more into the specificities of Italian Jewish history. I prepared a short PowerPoint presentation just so that you can see, for those of you who are not familiar with this part of history, so that you can see at least a very sort of limited but map of the peninsula. So the period going from the end of the 1790s and the First World War is known in Italy as the Risorgimento. The word means rebirth, resurrection, rising again. It conveys the image of the Italian nation rising to unification and independence. It was used by Italian patriots at the time, and it is still used today, and it is also used by scholars. Now, I will not go into all the details of all the different phases of the Risorgimento, but you can see from this map, this is not a very detailed map. It only contains sort of the main protagonists of this story, but you can see that Italy was divided into many different states. So the most important ones were the Papal States. Then you cannot see here, but there was also the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. This is because, of course, we should have different maps depending on the year we are looking at. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south, Lombardy and the Veneto, these were directly under Austrian domination in the northeast, and then in the northwest, Piedmont, Sardinia, the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. This is just because I would like to remind you of what the peninsula looked like before the unification. So these states are often called in Italian historiography stati preunitari, which means pre-unification, pre-unitarian states. This is an expression that is a little bit problematic because, and I think we must use it with caution, because it sort of implies a teleological reading of Italian history, sort of as if this history could not but end in the unification of the country, as if the unification of the country had been indeed a necessity, sort of the destiny of the unification. This is something the protagonists of the time, I mean, the men of the Risorgimento would have said. We as historians should be a little bit more cautious. So although the Kingdom of Italy was officially born in 1861, more precisely on March 17th, 1861, the Risorgimento, in fact, started much earlier. Now, you can see that in the map in 1861, Italy, yes, the Kingdom of Italy now exists as a unified nation state, but in fact, Italy is still missing a few important pieces, most importantly and most notably Rome. Rome is not part of Italy yet at this point in 1861, nor is the Veneto in the northeast, and then you have Savoy and Corse. I don't know the name in English actually. Well, that becomes France, of course, and is still France today. So the Risorgimento, as I said, started much earlier and in fact continued well after March 1861. And usually scholars tend to identify the beginning of the Risorgimento with the arrival of French troops on Italian soil in 1796. Then we have, of course, the Restoration that follows the end of the Napoleonic era and the Congress of Vienna. And the Congress of Vienna that was supposed to inaugurate an era of peace for Europe. In fact, it did inaugurate an era, decades of unrest, revolutions, rebellions, and wars in Europe. And these decades were characterized, if we look at the Italian case, by the creation of a very, very complex and rich transnational network to support the fight towards the independence and unification of the peninsula. And some of the key elements of these networks were actually built abroad. We can think of the case of Giuseppe Mazzini, who is probably with Giuseppe Garibaldi, sort of one of the leading figures of the Risorgimento that is really well known also abroad, was well known abroad at the time, and is well known abroad today. Mazzini was based in London, for much of the 1830s and 1840s because he was in exile. And so it was from London that he actually built his transnational network of patriots and rebels. The revolution of 1848, you asked about 1848. 1848 did represent a crucial turning point. The revolutions of 1848 really shook the entire peninsula and most of Europe, actually. And they opened new spaces for political activism and for direct participation in politics. And although they were very violently and soon crushed by repression, they left an enduring legacy in political and cultural terms. Or we could say in the process of an enduring legacy in the process of the nationalization of the masses, to use this expression that was very dear to George Mosse. And 1848 is also the moment when Piedmont takes on the military leadership of the unification process. And this also has significance for the Jewish side, as we will see later on. And in fact, if we look at the events that followed, we can describe the unification as the process through which Piedmont, the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, is able to annex bit by bit all of the Italian peninsula, and in a very poignant move, in a very important move, manages to conquer Rome in September 1870. And in 1871, Rome becomes the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. And this is, of course, very important, not only from the geopolitical perspective, because Rome is there stuck in the middle of the peninsula, but also from a symbolic perspective, because Rome has, of course, a huge importance as a symbol of the ancient power of imperial Rome, and as the symbol of the power of the Church, of the Catholic Church. And to get to sort of the Italy as we know it today, we must wait a little bit longer until the end of the First World War, when Trieste and Trento, which had been up until that time part of the Austrian Empire, were incorporated into the Italian kingdom. So I think I will stop here now, because I'm curious to have, yes, a little bit of an exchange of views with you.
Thank you so much. So how did the Jewish communities fit into this pre-unification system?
This is a very important and very complex question. So first of all, I think it is important to get an idea of the numbers, so of the exact magnitude of sort of Italian Jewry. What are we talking about when we focus on Italian Jewry? It is a very, very small minority, really a tiny minority. It oscillates between 30 and 40,000 individuals between the end of the 18th century and today. And this very tiny minority is also very unevenly distributed across the territory of the Italian peninsula. Let me go into some details. So in 1800, the year 1800, there were roughly 34,000 Jews out of 18 million people resident in the area contained within the Italian borders as they are today. A number that climbed to 43,000 out of nearly 34 million in the year 900, and then went down to 28,000 out of just over 45 million people in 1945, of course, as a consequence of the Holocaust. Now we are back roughly to 30 to 40,000 people. It is very difficult, of course, to get an exact number. It is much more difficult today than it was at the time, because it is not the membership of a Jewish community is not mandatory in Italy, so it's very difficult to have a clear map of the situation. So at the end of the 18th century, the regions with the largest number of Jews in absolute terms were Tuscany, Piedmont, with Tuscany with notably Livorno, Leghorn as being a very big Jewish community, Piedmont, Emilia-Romagna, Friuli Venezia Giulia with Trieste, the Veneto, and Lazio, of course, with Rome being the largest Jewish community. And there had been almost no Jews south of Rome since the expulsions that happened between the end of the 15th century, 1492, and the year 1541. So virtually no Jews in southern Italy. Things will change slightly in 1863 because a small Jewish community will be founded in Naples in 1863. So Naples will be a little bit of an exception in this story. The geography also of Italian Jewry changed considerably during the 19th century. And it is very clear that internal migrations were influenced by the political and economic development of the various regions and cities, and also by the process of the unification of the country. So it's really very clear that sort of Jewish history went hand in hand with sort of the progress of national history, the evolution of national history. The Jewish communities that were scattered across the peninsula were subject to very different legal systems. It's very difficult to reply, to have a short reply to your question, because there was no unified legal system. What they did have in common, these Jewish communities, was at least that they operated as sort of intermediaries between the individuals and the state authorities and the political authorities, following a practice that was really typical of the old regime, of the so-called Ancien Regime, and a practice that was not limited only to the Italian case, the Italian peninsula, and a practice that was also not limited solely to Jews. And it is quite common due to this situation. It is kind of a patchwork situation. It is quite common to speak of the existence in the Italian peninsula of a variety of Italian juries. So not one Italian jury, but a variety of Italian juries, especially prior to the unification, due to the very different history, legal status, socioeconomic structure, cultural and even religious characteristics of each community. Within Tuscany, for example, just to give you one example, within Tuscany and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, so this would be one political entity, the Jewish community of Florence was forced into a ghetto in the year 1570, while in Pisa and Livorno, so very close geographically speaking to Florence, while in Pisa and Livorno, Jews would enjoy the very peculiar status of sort of a privileged minority throughout the 17th and the 18th century, thanks to a document that is a very, very famous document, the legis patent called the Livornine. This document was issued in 1591, and then a second time with a few differences in 1593. So within the same sort of political entity, we can find very, very different situations for the Jewish communities and individual Jews. So again, a proper answer to this question would require a very, very long and detailed analysis of each and every individual context, which of course we cannot do here. But I think that this is per se, this difficulty in replying to such an important question, this is per se an interesting characteristic of Italian history and Italian Jewish history, and it has some consequences also for the future.
Thank you so much. So how were members of the Jewish communities involved in the unification process? And does the unification period reflect an emancipation process for the Jewish communities in Italy?
Yes. Yes. So the first answer to the second part of the question is yes, but of course I'm going to articulate a bit better. So if we understand, of course, all depends on how we define emancipation, and I'm not going into the details of the scholarly debate on emancipation right now, but if we understand emancipation in a very traditional sense, sort of as the process through which Jews were granted legal equality. So if we understand emancipation in this very traditional way, we can identify at least two main phases in Italian history, two main phases we must look at to find this the evolution of emancipation. So the first phase is linked to the arrival of the French troops in the Italian peninsula in 1796. The French Revolution exported its ideals and its laws, which included legal equality for Jews and other religious minorities. So it is interesting to note that not all Italian, well, I'm using Italian, of course, Italy does not exist at this point as a unified political entity, but so not all Jews that were resident in these territories welcomed these changes. We still need some more research on this period, but we know that many individuals jumped at the new opportunities that opened up for them in terms of professions and social exchanges, life, in every aspect of life, the possibility to take active part in politics for the first time, to graduate in law, for example, and many other opportunities. But very often Jewish communities per se, so the institutions, were extremely cautious, and very often they kept a very low profile for a variety of reasons. And again, we cannot get into the detailed analysis of each and every individual context and case. One reason, of course, that we can easily guess, imagine, and is that the situation was that there was no guarantee that the situation would last for a long time, and in fact, it didn't last. With the restoration of 1814, 1815, the situation for the Jews of the peninsula, basically, if we had to summarize in a few words, went back to the period before 1796, with a few important differences. So, for example, in the Veneto provinces, the restoration did not mean returning to the ghetto. So this is an important difference. But if we look, for example, at the case of Piedmont, we see that the situation, at least on paper, the situation of the Jews actually worsened after the restoration, because there was a complete ban on property ownership. and an injunction to transfer ownership of all acquired property that Jews would have acquired during the French period. Then I said on paper, because then if we look at social practices, what really happened, we see that the two things, the law and the practice, well, these don't always match. But at least on paper, the situation got actually worse. So we need to look to see the second phase of the emancipation in Italy. We need to look again at 1848. So this is really a crucial year. Because in 1848, many sovereigns of these Italian states, pre-unification states, many sovereigns were forced to grant their citizens constitutions. And most of these constitutions granted Jews and other religious minorities legal equality. Now it is worth looking a little bit more in depth at one of these constitutions. And this is the Statuto Albertino, so this constitution that takes its name from the King of Piedmont, Charles Albert, Carlo Alberto in Italian. This was granted on March 4th, 1848. Let's look at what it said. Well, first of all, Article 1 states that the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion is the sole religion of the state. So there is a prominent role for the Catholic religion. All other forms of worship now existing are tolerated in conformity with the law. Article 24 states that all subjects of the kingdom are equal before the law, regardless of their rank or title. All shall equally enjoy civil and political rights and shall be eligible to civil and military offices except as otherwise provided by law. Now, this document does grant legal emancipation, legal equality to religious minorities, but there are still some question marks in a way. So in order to have the full, explicit and legal emancipation, we need to look at two royal decrees that were issued we are always in Piedmont, in March and June 1848. In March, this royal decree said all the Israelites are granted civil rights and the right to access university degrees. And the royal decree, June 19th, 1848, stated that religious difference cannot be the base for discrimination in civil and political rights and in the access to civil and military offices. So we can really see at this point that in 1848, in Piedmont, the Jews enjoyed full emancipation and full legal equality. So this constitution is particularly important because it is the only one that will survive the repression of the revolutions of 1848. And this constitution will become, in 1861, the constitution of the Kingdom of Italy. And if we remember that, as I said, starting from this year, 1848, Piedmont became the political and military leader of the process of the unification of the country, we can see that at this point, the history of Jewish emancipation and the history of the political unification of the country are very strictly linked to one another. And this circumstance did not really escape the notice of contemporary observers, nor that of the successors. There is a convergence of events between the unification and how the unification unfolded and the process of emancipation. And this convergence of events was often interpreted at the time and throughout the second half of the 19th century as if sort of this new Italy were intrinsically tied to the mission of liberty, a mission of liberty that included the emancipation of the Jews. Now, this does not really correspond to reality. It is an interpretation of the events, but it is an interpretation that became really the main sort of the backbone of the national patriotic narrative as it was built and represented and reproposed by Italian Jews, again, throughout the 19th century, but also in the first part of the 20th century. It also became a little bit part of the historiography, sort of the historical interpretation of the Risorgimento, seen from a Jewish sort of perspective. And I think it is also important to remember that emancipation did not only come as sort of a gracious concession, because in various contexts, Jews and Jewish communities mobilized to call for legal equality, something that was quite new in the Italian case. For example, in Piedmont, a special Israelite committee was constituted in 1845, chaired by a rabbi, Rabbi Lelio Cantoni, and its original mission was, in fact, to investigate the state of the communities of Piedmont. But very soon this committee became instrumental in awakening public opinion, Jewish and non-Jewish public opinion, and the sovereign to the cause of emancipation. And one of the leaders of this movement was David Levy. He was Piedmontese man, born in Chieri, and he was initiated to Freemasonry and also to the Giovine Italia, Young Italy, the Mazzinian society, he was very close to Mazzini. And he was a poet, a writer, but also a politician. He was elected to the Parliament of the Kingdom of Sardinia in 1860, and then to the Italian Parliament in 1861. We must remember that in March 1848, so shortly before, a few days before the Statuto was granted, David Levy met the king in person and the representatives of the Piedmont, David Levy met the king as the man representing the Piedmontese Jewish communities. And he pleaded the cause of the emancipation. Many Jews supported not only the mobilization to get legal equality, but also the wars of the Risorgimento. If we look always at 1848, there is a letter dated March 22nd, 1848, in which Rabbi Lelio Cantoni, a very important figure at the time, not only for Piedmont, but I would say for the whole peninsula, Lelio Cantoni celebrated the departure of the volunteers for one of the wars of the Risorgimento, very important one in 1848. And he said, "I hold it certain that this prelude to our liberation will be felt and put into practice everywhere with equal passion." So he's also connecting the liberation of the Jews, so legal emancipation, and the liberation of the country, so of Italy, from sort of the presence of foreign powers, and the fight for the unification of the country. And along these same lines, if we look at the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in 1847, we see that in September 1847, a civic guard was instituted in Tuscany. And it was at the beginning a bit unclear whether the Jews would be admitted to the civic guard or not, because it was custom that Jews would not be allowed to bear sort of weapons, to carry weapons. But in the end, it became clear that Jews would be admitted. And a jurist, Isacco Rignano, well, he was a lawyer, Isacco Rignano, a Jewish lawyer from Livorno. He wrote, through this virtuous institution, so the civic guard, the way has been finally opened for the Israelites to give their lives and resources for the homeland. And so to fulfill one of the most pressing religious duties. So this would be not only a patriotic duty, but also a religious duty, that of loving, serving, and sacrificing oneself for one's native land. Sorry. And it would actually be impossible to map out all the Jewish contributions to the process of the unification and to the battles of the Risorgimento. I will mention just a couple if I have the time. Please do stop me if this is too long. I would like just to mention a couple more additional examples. So one is that of Venice. In Venice, the insurrection that broke out in 1848 to cast out the Austrians was led by Daniele Manin. He was not Jewish, but he had a Jewish paternal grandfather. Two of his collaborators, very close collaborators, were two Jewish men, a rabbi, Abramo Lattes, and another rabbi, this man, Samuele Salomone Olper. Olper was a Republican, a follower of Mazzini, and he was appointed secretary of the provisional government in 1848. So he had a very, very prominent role, a political role in the revolution of 1848 in Venice. And then in 1849, Olper was sent by Manin as an envoy to the Roman Republic. And then after the repression of the revolutions, he moved to Florence, then Livorno, and finally Piedmont. And he was appointed chief rabbi of Piedmont. So if we look at the actual battles, it is quite difficult, of course, to estimate how many Jews participated in the battles fought during the Risorgimento campaigns. We know, however, that many Jews did fight. Some of them fought also because they were Jewish. They kind of linked the process of the emancipation with the battle for the unification of the countries. Others fought really mainly as Italian patriots without sort of huge stress on their Jewishness. I will just mention one example. So one of these men who fought for Italy, Jewish men, was Gustavo Uzielli. He was the son of a prominent Jewish member of the Jewish community of Livorno, Sansone Uzielli. He was a banker. The family was very active in philanthropic activities, both within the Jewish community and in the city of Livorno. Gustavo graduated from the University of Pisa. He became a very important geographer in post-unification Italy. He was one of the founding members of the Italian Geographical Society. And he was also a friend and patron of this group of painters, patriotic painters, that were called the Macchiaioli. In 1859, Gustavo Uzielli joined the Cacciatori delle Alpi. These were part of the men who followed Garibaldi in the expedition of the Thousand. He fought in the Battle of the Volturno that took place in October 1860. He got a medal for this, for his courage and for his role in the battle. And this episode was later painted by Giovanni Fattori, who was one of the Macchiaioli and quite well-known painter in Italy, this painting that is entitled "The Battle of the Volturno," I'm sharing a detail of the painting here. And I chose this detail because Giovanni Fattori turned to his friend Gustavo Uzielli for the sort of composition of this work, this painting, and Fattori portrayed Uzielli in the painting in a position of real prominence, because we can see him loading a cannon. So this is Gustavo Uzielli. Well, I don't know if you can see any kind of real resemblance with the with the photograph, but this is supposed to be sort of Gustavo Uzielli, and we could actually really go on and find many more other examples of Jewish direct involvement in the Risorgimento, as intellectuals, as fighters, as politicians, in all sorts of roles. I will stop sharing now because I can go back to some of these points later if we have time.
Wonderful. We have three more main sort of substantive questions. I want to try to make them into two because I think otherwise we're going to go very long. So let me ask that first one, which relates to the Catholic Church and the Jewish communities in Italy. So the Vatican and the Italian Catholic Church were very important in Italian politics, as you've mentioned, prior to unification. And if I understand correctly, they still are. Did Jewish community members work with Catholic authorities, Vatican or Italian Catholic Church per se in the unification process?
Yes, of course, the presence of the Catholic Church right in the center of the peninsula is really important and played an important role in how the process of the unification unfolded. And also, we cannot deny that Catholicism and Catholic culture more broadly played and still plays a prominent role in Italian culture, in Italian history and Italian culture. And also it is important to, well, everybody knows this, but I think it is also important to remember that the majority of Italians were and still are, at least on paper, Catholic. At least on paper, then if we look at how many people really are really observant, then the numbers, of course, change dramatically, but at least on paper. And if we look at the lists of people who are baptized, the overwhelming majority of Italians were and still are Catholic. Now, at the time, if we look at the 19th century, there were only two religious minorities that were relevant in some ways. Very tiny, if we look at the numbers, but still very relevant. So these were the Jews, so the Jewish minority, and Protestants. Protestants were mainly, we can find Protestant communities in Piedmont, Florence, Naples, So they were sort of concentrated in a few very well-defined sort of areas, geographically speaking. And now the situation would be different, of course. It's much more varied than it was at the time. But at the time, when people thought of religious minorities, they would think of Jews and Protestants. And the emancipation of Jews and Protestants actually went hand in hand. So the role of the Catholic Church was really crucial, especially, well, in different ways throughout the 19th century, but especially in the years 1846, 1849, let's say. Because in 1846, and I will share my PowerPoint again, in 1846, Pius IX was elected to the papal throne, well, it was a throne because he was also a king, not only the Pope. He was a Pope King, or King Pope. And Pius IX was welcomed as a liberal Pope. A Pope who would really endorse the cause of the unification of the country, of the liberation of the country, of the fight against the foreign powers, but especially the cause of liberty, of freedom, of civil rights. And at the beginning, it really looked like Pius IX would be a liberal Pope. One of the first things that he did as soon as after the election, he granted an amnesty to all political prisoners. And this is when he was celebrated across the Italian peninsula, but also abroad, as the Pope of Freedom. You can see in these lithographies, I hope this word exists in English, I didn't check the translation. You can see in you can see how Pius IX was represented as a close ally of liberty, freedom. And the Pope, if you look at the picture, the image to the right, you can see how he is represented like blessing Italy. So this woman kneeling before the Pope is the representation of Italy. So he's blessing Italy, and he's blessing also the political project of the unification of the country, and a political project that is a liberal political project. So it is a project that includes also, among other things, other important things, such as the freedom of the press and other things. It includes also the emancipation of the Jews. And it was a really big deal coming from the Pope, if we think of the very dire situation in which the Jews of Rome had lived and had been living for centuries under the papacy. The situation in the ghetto of Rome was horrible. It was really the worst ghetto of all. So this was a really big deal. Pius IX in these years became a hero, not only for Catholic patriots, but more or less for everyone. Also patriots who were really anti-clerical sort of thinkers and sort of politicians, and also for many Jews. We have many sources that tell us of Jews who were enthusiastically going to see the Pope and really believed that this Pope would also endorse the cause of sort of Jewish emancipation, and would really sort of solve the conflict between sort of this sort of the Catholic Church and sort of the Jews, which was quite a big one. And of course, things didn't go this way. So here you have just the cover of the book from which I took these images. Of course, things didn't go this way, and Pius IX actually turned out to be one of the worst popes in history in terms of his relationship with anything modern. He turned out to be the Pope that would condemn modernity, political modernity, and modernity in general in all its forms. And he became the Pope who would, in 1871, excommunicate the King of Italy, the Prime Minister of the newly born Italian kingdom, and all sorts of other leading figures, intellectuals and politicians. The Pope who would prohibit Catholics from taking part in Italian political life. Now, if we look at Jews, it is interesting to note, at least, that this fact that Italy was in the end constructed against the Catholic Church. In 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy conquers Rome, it is not an amicable, friendly visit. It's a military conquest. And the Pope is really angry about it, and he excommunicates, as I said, the king, the prime minister, and another bunch of important people. Italy and the Catholic Church fight throughout the 19th century a sort of a Cold War. It's a cultural war, but it's a very fierce and violent war. So we have this paradox that the newly founded Italian kingdom is made of overwhelmingly made of Catholics. Its ruling elites also are, well, at least on paper, Catholic men, most of them, not all of them, some of them are Jewish or Protestant, but most of them are Catholic. But the first decades of the political life of the Kingdom of Italy are characterized by a very strong anti-clericalism and a very strong opposition to the Catholic Church. Many scholars have argued, although it is quite difficult to prove it, but many scholars have argued that this Cold War between the Catholic Church and the newly founded Italian kingdom has actually favored the integration of Italian Jews into all spheres of society, so politics, academia, and all sorts of everything you can think of, really, both at local and national level. And I think there is some truth to this point, although, again, if we look at the sources, it is very difficult to sort of prove beyond any doubt that this is the case, but I do think it is a very important characteristics of the process of integration after the legal equality was granted, the process of integration of Italian Jews into Italian society.
Thank you so much. So we are running long, so I want to try to combine the last questions. And then maybe we can open it up to questions from the webinar audience. So the questions are, did Jewish freedoms in socio-political arenas increase as a cause of the unification of the Italian states into modern Italy? And was anti-Semitism a concern in 19th century Italy? Is that part of the motivation for Jewish communities in supporting unification? And then the final question is, do you recommend a few texts that our audience can turn to?
Yes, thank you. So I will try to be very brief. I will try, but please do stop me if I end up running long again. I want to show you just couple of pictures that are of images that represent the new synagogues, some of the new synagogues that were built after the unification, which means after the emancipation. And I think this is meaningful because these are called sort of monumental synagogues. They really represent the way in which Italian Jews really enthusiastically embraced this new life in the new state and the new opportunities that opened up for them, but also the new opportunities that opened up for them, not only in individual terms, but also as a community. So the new visibility that they could have as a Jewish community. So not only as an individual who could be elected to parliament or become a full professor at the university, of course, that was very important, but also there was a new visibility as a community, as an institution. This is why they want really to conquer the urban space by building these very big and beautiful synagogues, while before the emancipation, this would have been prohibited because synagogues could exist, and they did exist, but they had to remain hidden. So no sign outside of the building could indicate that inside there was a synagogue. Or a Jewish sort of prayer, a location sort of for Jewish prayer. We have these synagogues. We can look at least 3 examples very, very briefly. So Turin, the case of Turin is quite peculiar because in Turin, the Jewish community really wanted to build an extraordinary building, the one on the left. That's the part of the project by architect Alessandro Antonelli, who won a public call that was precisely for the new synagogue. Now, in the end, the synagogue was not built exactly according to this project because there were a few problems, mainly financial problems, and the Jewish community could not afford to go forward with this very, very ambitious project. So this building, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Turin, but this building was sold, the project was sold to the municipality, and this building then became what is now known as the Mole Antonelliana, which is really the defining monument of Turin. I mean, if you've been there, it is what you see from a distance is the Mole Antonelliana, and it became the Museum of the Risorgimento. And the Jewish community settled for a slightly less ambitious building, the one you see in the picture. It was inaugurated in 1884, so it's just slightly less ambitious. You cannot see it from a distance as the Mole Antonelliana, but still, it is a prominent building. This is Florence. Inaugurated in 1882. Again, some of you may be familiar with this building. Again, a very big and very visible building with this style that was very typical at the time, combined some sort of Oriental elements. And this is the Jewish synagogue, the new synagogue inaugurated in Rome on July the 27th, 1904. This is called as the Tempio Maggiore now in Rome, and its location, not only this is a very visible building. It is on the river Tevere, but its location is very important because it is located within the old, what had been the ghetto of Rome, but it also faces the Vatican. So if you look at an aerial picture, you can see that it is actually very close to St. Peter, and there is some architectural elements that also recall Cathedral, St. Peter. So it is also built to show that Jews can now openly also challenge, in a way, the overwhelming presence of the Catholic Church in Italy. I will. As concerns anti-Semitism, I would like just to, I'll stop sharing, just to make a couple of examples very, very briefly again. Yes and no. So anti-Semitism was anti-Semitism a cause for concern? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it was present in various forms, in the more traditional form of the Christian and Catholic anti-Semitism, sometimes called anti-Judaism, and that was still very well alive, and if anything, it became stronger in the second half of the 19th century, with the proliferation also of accusations of ritual murder that were published discussed in prominent Catholic journals. So that was still alive and kicking, I would say. But there were other forms of anti-Semitism that were present also in non-Catholic circles. And I will just give you two examples very, very briefly. We have in Livorno, there was this man, Francesco Domenico Guerrazzi. He was a patriot, a democratic patriot, anti-clerical, so he was not a Catholic. He was anti-religion, anti-Catholicism, anti-Christianity, anti all sorts of religions, structured religions. He enters into a bit of a fight with Sansone Uzielli, a banker. I mentioned him because he was Gustavo Uzielli's father. And he writes he attacks Sansone Uzielli with these words. So this is 1833. And Guerrazzi writes, "Where there is money, there is a Jew." And then always referring to Jews, he says, "They cheat with impunity. They maintain themselves as Moses made them. Whether in Tuscany or Romagna or Poland, everywhere is Egypt for them. Every populace Egyptian. They pass through the centuries and people like oil through water." And then in 1946, he refers to Sansone Uzielli as a spider at the bottom of a hole, lying in wait for a fly to snatch his portion of usury. So these are quite heavy words, and these are coming from a man who was not, again, a Catholic, not at all. His anti-Semitism came from his idea that Jews represented the elite that was oppressing the people, common people. Very, very briefly, 1901, Ferrara, so we change location and moment in time. Eugenio Righini was a nationalist from Ferrara. He was a journalist, and he published a booklet entitled "Anti-Semitism and Semitism in modern Italian politics." And in this booklet, he denounced the overrepresentation of Jews in position of power, particularly political power. And he writes that Jews belong to two nations, their own nation, the Jewish one, and the one where they were born and live. And Now, as a brief comment to this, I would say that Regini was right in one respect, because if we look at how tiny the Jewish minority was, Jews were in fact overrepresented in what we might call positions of power in academia, in politics, but mainly because they had sort of a level of literacy on average that was much higher than the literacy level of the rest of the population. And also most Jews really enthusiastically endorsed this new Italy, also because it brought, not only because, but also because it brought legal equality. So there was, if we look at numbers, there was some kind of overrepresentation, but Regini implies that this overrepresentation means that Jews are acting as a lobby, sort of as a foreign lobby within the nation, so a lobby that did not act in favor of sort of the Italian nation, but on the contrary, a lobby that would act just with other goals. Now, that is not true, of course, not at all. So that is where Regini's argument sort of fails, and of course we can confidently, very confidently say that he was absolutely wrong. But the argument became very, very popular, and it was also then it had a long success, and we can find it also in fascist anti-Semitic propaganda, for example, decades after the publication of this booklet by Regini. I'll stop here.
If you want to give us some suggestions of text, that would be great.
Yes.
We can do that maybe with questions or as you prefer.
Yeah, no, I had actually the last slide of my PowerPoint was included a few titles. So here, of course, the list could be much longer, although it is quite difficult to find books that are written in English about 19th century Italian Jewish history. It is much easier for the 20th century fascism and racist laws. There is another one now that I think of it that I should have included, but I can maybe send you an email with a few titles. So if you have people who are interested, then you can share the list. Here I included an edited volume that I co-edited with two colleagues, entitled Italian Jewish Networks, from the 17th to the 20th century. So I thought it would be interesting because of this very long chronological sort of span. Then the book by Francesca Bregoli, Mediterranean Enlightenment, which focuses on Livorno, which is a hugely interesting case. Then I included, sorry about that, but I included my book, Making Italian Jews. And then I included this book by Michele Sarfatti, which is on a later period because it is on fascism, but it is really a crucially important book. It's not a new book. It was published, I think the first edition came out in 2000. So it's not a new book, but it's really a milestone. I mean, it was a hugely influential book, and very reliable, very rich, very well researched. So I definitely recommend it.
Thank you so much for a fascinating and informative talk. I'd like to open up to audience questions. You can raise your hand and I can press a button here that allows you to talk, or you can send your questions in the Q&A box, as you prefer. Do we have anyone wanting to ask questions? Okay. Well, I rushed us through the last few questions. Let's see. Again, if anybody wants to ask questions, you can raise your hand and I can allow you to talk, or you can put a question in the Q&A box.
In the meanwhile, if no one, oh, there is something in the Q&A. Yes.
How did anti-Semitism vary by region before and after unification?
Shall I reply now? Shall we wait for more questions?
I think it's probably, oh, here we have another question. Where were you able to identify any instances of Ashkenazi Judaism in Italy specifically, or was it predominantly Sephardic?
Yep.
And so far, that's all we have for questions. So as Professor Carlotta Uberti is speaking, please feel free to put more Q&A questions in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and we can actually allow you to speak if you'd like.
Okay, so I will start with these two questions then. So the first one is really complicated. I have to say at the very beginning that some important research has been done and is being currently done on the topic of anti-Semitism in 19th century Italy, but we still have a long way to go because scholarship has tended to focus on, for obvious reasons, has tended to focus on the fascist period. And maybe the 1920s, so and the period just the 1910s, so just before fascism, just to try and explain fascist anti-Semitism. And also there was for quite a long time this idea also in scholarship that anti-Semitism in the Italian case was really kind of a fascist invention. Aside from very traditional Christian and Catholic anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, the idea was that there was no real anti-Semitism in Italian culture prior to fascism. And it is only quite recently, well, by recently I mean the last 20 to 30 years, not the last year, but still, it is only quite recently that scholars have really worked hard at deconstructing this idea of the good Italian, and have really worked hard, very hard at trying to reconstruct the 19th century roots of anti-Semitism in the Italian case, or better, the variety of forms that anti-Semitism embodied and took throughout the 19th century, and even before that, of course. But let's look at the 19th century, when Italy was made sort of as a political entity, as a nation state. So this to say that there is still a lot that we do not know well, and especially it is quite difficult to answer because there were differences if we look at different regions, but since we don't have all the research, it is quite difficult to give a detailed reply. What I can say, though, is that it has proven to be really fruitful to look at local elections. So what happens in the period preceding local elections when there is a Jewish candidate? So what happens in the press, for example? How is the Jewish candidate portrayed? Is their Jewishness sort of highlighted as an element that people should sort of reflect on before deciding to vote, whether to vote for this person or not? Has this topic of the Jewish lobby sort of been brought up or not? And we have nice research on the case of Mantova for now, something on Rome, but not much. And the rest is still something that we must work on. But I think that is really the one of the most fruitful things that we can do in order to find finally an answer to your question. And as for the second question, well, yes. Italy is has a very varied landscape in terms of sort of the different Jewish cultures, and also in terms of Jewish traditions. And we have some communities are predominantly Sephardic, or were at least predominantly Sephardic. So, for example, Pisa and Livorno. Livorno was predominantly Sephardic until the 20th. Well, during the 19th century, something starts to change because there is an immigration from Rome. And then many Sephardic Jews from Livorno decide to leave Livorno. So things, the demographic, sort of the composition of the community changes, but up until, I would say, mid-19th century, Livorno is almost only Sephardic, and for sure the elite of the community remains strongly, predominantly Sephardic until the 20th century. And you can also, now you can really feel this in the community, in what is left of the what was once a very, very strong and big community. Same would go for Pisa. But for example, if we look at Rome, we find sort of more of a mix, and we find Italian Jews, so who are neither Sephardic nor Ashkenazi, but just Italkim, same. Well, Milan is quite another different case, because Milan was not at all an important community up until this, I would say, the second half of the 19th century, and then it became one of the most important Italian Jewish communities. And now, if we think of Italian Jews now, we really can identify Rome and Milan as the two centers of Jewish life in Italy. But the case of Milan, as I said, is much different from Livorno and Rome, for example, because the sort of Jewish settlement in Milan was not as strong during up until the second half of the 19th century. So we must look at a later period to really see how the community was built. And Milan has never been a really strongly Sephardic community. On the contrary, it's completely different from Livorno, but also completely different from Rome. So again, very sort of a patchwork situation in Italy. And the other question,
there is one additional question now.
Yeah.
Were any Jewish leaders or parts of Jewish communities not in favor of unification due to fears regarding assimilation, similar to those that some Orthodox communities had in the French case?
Okay, now I wouldn't say that there were important leaders or segments of Jewish society who were against emancipation and integration into Italian society, but for sure, starting very early in the immediate aftermath of the emancipation and the unification of the country, we do find leaders of Jewish communities and rabbis who express worries, who state that they are very worried because although they are patriots and they are completely in favor of the Italian Unification and the contribution that Jews can bring to the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, they are also worried that legal equality could mean in a few decades could lead to the disappearance of Jewish communities and Jews in Italy because of assimilation. And they differentiate between sort of a right way to be Italian Jews or Jewish Italians, a way that would manage to combine these two identities without renouncing to one or the other. And this is the way they try to teach, for example, many leaders, community leaders and rabbis try to teach, for example, through the periodical press, Italian Jewish journals. So that would be the right way. And they try to distinguish this right way from assimilation, which would be renouncing to any form of Jewish identity and connection to Jewish communities, to be just Italians. And that is something that is strongly rejected. Of course, it is embraced by some, but it is strongly rejected by leaders of Jewish communities and Italian rabbis. I hope this is an acceptable.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions or hands up. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank you for a wonderful, informative talk. I think it's we've all probably learned a great deal from it. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.